Well, good morning. I'm going to just take this because it's too high for me. And it's an honor for me. I'm Amy Rosen. It is an honor for me to be here with these three, soon-to-be four spectacular women. And as we all gathered here a few minutes earlier, it was notable to us that we did have a panel of education experts, all who were women, put together by some very competent business school students, but there is, between these four women, there is a considerable amount of brain power, and they have really, all four of them, really made this their life's work, and it's not easy work, and I think driven all together by a basic interest that all kids should have an opportunity for a great education. They all have, from now a superintendent's point of view, from leading a major think tank, Carnegie Foundation, to being at a company that's actually trying to figure out the technology and bring the private sector into the public sector to do district reform, and from obviously the largest education foundation in America. Is that true? I don't want to cause a problem with Michele here.
Oh, are you kidding?
Thank you. Okay. And I won't, I'm not going to go too much into all of their bios because you all have them. But I will say that, each year that I teach this class at Columbia on education leadership, all of them have participated in one way or another, or their organizations have. And the work they're doing has really inspired so many of my students, and I see many of them in the room here, to actually become the next generation of folks doing this work. So thank you all for what you've done every day. The title of this panel is Scaling Innovation in the Education Sector. And I am going to take the liberty to, using my technology, which is always challenging, let me just do this again. Given yesterday on the internet, after Steve Jobs died, and obviously one of the great innovators of certainly all of our generations, but not necessarily somebody we think about a leading force in education, that there was a quote from a speech that he gave in 1995, and if we don't think he was a visionary, it was just, to me, it just hit between my eyes that, smart people have gotten this for a long time. And if I can just indulge me, I just wanted to read it. I'm a very big believer in equal opportunity as opposed to equal outcome. I don't believe in equal outcome because, unfortunately, life's not like that. It would be pretty boring place if it was. But I really believe in equal opportunity. Equal opportunity to me, more than anything, means a great education. Maybe even more important than in a great family life. But it pains me because we do know how to provide a great education. We really do. We could make sure that every young child in this country got a great education. We just fall far short of that. I know from my own education that if I hadn't encountered 2 or 3 individuals that spent extra time with me, I'm sure I would have been in jail. I'm 100% sure that if it hadn't been for Mrs. Hill in 4th grade and a few others, I would have absolutely ended up in jail. So with that, we'll begin this discussion. And everybody here, and I've had the privilege of working with 3 out of 4 of you pretty intensely, have been part of the reform efforts in New York. And without a doubt, from the very beginning, it was Chancellor Klein and Mayor Bloomberg's intention to sort of drive innovation and use it to radically change the school system. And since all 4 of you played different parts in that, and this has been actually a nice reunion for all of us, and have had some time to actually think about and bring to your own current professional challenges, learnings from that. Let's just start at that point. And Michele, I learned today that actually Michele and Kristen came the very first day together. So she wasn't the first in, but since Michele was definitely Joel's thought partner in every respect in the design of the theory of change and the vision of Children's First, Michele, can you just sort of open with explaining that and talking a little bit about your takeaways and reflections on it.
Sure. Thank you, Amy. And it's wonderful to see such a great crowd focusing on innovation in education. And when Joel Klein was announced as chancellor, and it was going to be a non-traditional chancellor, not coming out of the education world, and Mayor Bloomberg was determined to do something quite bold with the school system. Joel and I did know each other, and we met right away. And in a few days, he asked me to come and help him drive innovation through this big system. So it's very, it's a great opportunity to think about the opportunity that presented to all of us that we were given with the major reform in 2002. And what we had connected about was the notion that we needed to create a system of good schools. Now, the locution was very deliberate. That is not a good school system, but a system of good schools. And the notion that every school had to work for students and for children, for youth, and that every school had to have a mission, a purpose, be able to have a leader who could understand that and who also had professional technical expertise, and be able to bring together groups of very capable teachers. But we could go on from that, have internal accountability for its students towards some goal. And that if we improved the system 20%, but we still had this array of schools out in Brownsville or Central Harlem or the South Bronx that were limping along, or that where we would not, the reform was not reaching them, that we would not be successful. But the second part of that, and I'll try to do this quickly to two or three quick points, was the notion that we had to change people's mindset that there needed to be a system of good schools, right? And then I think other people here will talk about a range of ways that had to be built into. And the third is that we needed proof points. That is, people are used to bureaucracies talking at them, right? It's a little, people are rather inured to that. So we needed to immediately start with some of the hardest challenges. It may be hard for many of you to know that in 2002, there was almost no reform going on at the high school level in the country. There was really a belief that we built up from kindergarten and built higher reading scores, and that, eventually we would get there because, and what we actually said was, no, we have, first of all, a moral responsibility to kids who are 15, 16, 17 years old. But secondly, this is a really critical design problem for innovation because we know what a good high school looks like. We have research about what this is. And we have some theories about the dimensions of that for kids who are behind academically and also experiencing poverty, have to do with identity as well as competence. And that we're going to close the dysfunctional parts of the system and create these new small schools. And I'm going to just finish these opening remarks by saying that was really bold because we committed, and the chancellor committed in October of the first year to creating 200 new small schools within the next 3 years, and to create them with the design elements I was just describing of principals and teachers and community. And to do that was really what a lot of people will talk about, the lift that was involved there. But finally, it actually worked, which is the important thing for this conference and reflecting back on, because none of us should be doing innovation for innovation's sake, right? Although it can be a more interesting job than some of the other jobs, it really doesn't matter if we're not getting the kind of results that we have. And so we took the risk of having a study by MDRC that was a random assignment study that has really given great, really some very promising data, including that in these schools, we cut the achievement gap for African American and Latino students by a third. So let me just end there, but sort of say that was the way of basically saying we needed to both put out a theory of change, but we also needed to very quickly start showing what that could look like to build confidence that this could be done and go against the incredible inertia of the system of low expectations.
Thank you, and I do hope this is a conversation, so please, please feel free to comment. So let's just take that, though, for a minute from where you left off, Michele. And Kristen, as the person who actually came in to run the office that created these hundreds of new schools, interested, while we all know that all the successes are tied to obviously the primacy of principals and teachers, looking back now, I can't even remember, is that 2004, 2005, 2003? 2003. So, we know a lot now. So could you just sort of share on your reflections of both the challenges of implementing innovation and where you look back and see real progress and where you look back and see real struggles still?
Well, thanks for having us. It's a pleasure to be here. And it feels like an eternity ago when we started that work. But I guess there are two ways I'd answer the question. The first is the success. Yes, we got the schools opened. That was a heavy lift logistically and operationally, but it doesn't really matter if what we opened was essentially the same as what we closed to make room for what we opened for the new next generation of schools. And I think the study that Michele cited is the most powerful piece of evidence that there was success there. But in terms of how we pulled it off, it was rather a large feat, and it was something that required so many people from within the organization. And we did a few things around scaling innovation that I think are similar to what happens in startup communities, in the tech communities, for example. We had, though they weren't called this at the time, things akin to startup weekends. We needed to recruit a huge amount of human talent, entrepreneurs who were educators or interested in education, and we had some reason to believe they would be successful at starting these brand new enterprises and recruiting even more talented people than themselves to actually teach the kids. And so we created gatherings. We tried to create a buzz around the opportunity to create these schools. We made it competitive. We did a lot of matchmaking of these entrepreneurial types and educators who'd been in the system for a long, long time but didn't necessarily want to pursue the traditional career ladder of waiting so long until they may have the opportunity to become an administrator. And this was the first time the system sort of created an opening for startups, essentially, that were going to be capitalized by the central office if they met certain prerequisites around the school design principles that Michele outlined and quality, and had been really deliberate about what they were doing. So some of those tactics were very helpful in scaling the innovation. We tried to also eliminate the reinvention of the wheel phenomenon, and so as much as we could strip away from them in terms of the heavy lifting of the administrative side, if you will, of starting schools, and free up these educators to focus on the school design and the vision of the school. Those are some of the strategies that I think were more effective in that regard. And in terms of the macro reflection on this stream of work within the overall reform Michele was describing, I think an interesting piece of it was, at the time, you have to remember the overall school context, the reform context. We were going through a massive centralization of control, really, to stabilize a system that had been really not performing well for a very long time. So a lot of our reforms were about bringing everyone together, making the system more coherent and more transparent, and it felt like a lot of standardization of a system that had been highly fragmented prior to our arrival. That wasn't the end goal, but that was an essential first step for the system reform. Meanwhile, this new school strategy that was really born out of Michele's experience and knowledge of what would work at the high school level was a major disruptive strategy. So in a lot of ways, we were birthing these new schools into an environment that was about entrepreneurialism and finding best practices and scaling them that was a very healthy tension with the rest of the system. And they were sort of leading the way for the rest of the reform that would follow.
Yeah. So this is actually a perfect place for me to dive in. The tension between disruption and innovation and order in what feels like chaos. Enter my time at Newark. Sorry, that's my phone causing problems. Right, someone's calling. So first of all, it's also amazing to be here, and what I find incredible about this conversation is thinking about how far away 2003 seems in a good way, and how much the conversation has changed, and how much people at this table, and in particular the reforms in New York, have changed the conversation. And what we used to think was disruptive is now considered commonplace, and I think that's a credit to a couple of the ladies to my right and others in this room. I mean, I would say, as I try to apply what I learned from my time in New York, and I came, I don't know, 2005 or something?
2005, I think.
A couple years.
Yeah.
But I had been working around the
2004,
system
yeah.
through New Leaders
Right.
and Teach for America, so had worked closely with several chancellors. So I had a very sort of deep insight into the kind of theory of change prior to Chancellor Klein's administration, is that the work is in managing that tension. That sort of if you swing too far one way or the other, I'm not sure we're going to get to a complete transformation of a system, at least at the size of Newark. New York, I think, is a little bit different because you can sort of experiment in ways that it's so large that the way that the mistakes or the downsides of innovation and experimentation, in some ways for good, kind of cancel themselves out at this kind of scale. Whereas in a place as small as Newark, it sort of doesn't. And let me be specific about what I mean by that. The things that I learned from New York, first of all, the mindset shift, the notion of principal as chief executive, the notion of the central office as facilitative and sort of removing operational barriers, the idea that accountability is not a rudimentary yardstick, but in fact, a more sophisticated measure of gains that takes into account student needs. I mean, these are all, again, we find them so pedestrian now, but like these were revolutionary ideas in 2003 that that if a student isn't reading by at grade level by third grade, that we don't have to throw away the keys and start predicting prison seats, and that closing schools and programs is often is something in the toolkit we all need to embrace, because sometimes things are just too broken to fix, and kids' lives are at stake, and we can't just say someday we might fix it. So closing needs to be in our toolkit. Those are all sort of very particular, specific things I take with me from my time in New York City, and that in some ways we kind of take for granted now in the dialogue. And let's remember that we didn't even, 7-8 years ago. Some of the challenges and things I'm wrestling with are, what do you hold tight and what do you hold loose? And how do you do that in a system that inherently lacks capacity? And how do we know that? Because 40% of my kids are reading and doing math at grade level. So there's tension there. Things like enrollment. We had a lot of struggles and dialogues around the new schools when we started them on things like special education, overage undercredited kids. Whose job is that? And when you start to introduce new things and you're desperate for success and for some conditions that can produce good ideas, it's often tough, and you can, without meaning to, create a real tale of two cities, where there are certain kids who are able to be in entrepreneurial environments and tend to be slightly higher performing and better choosers than others. Without even doing that meaningfully, that can happen, because you just end up, where they're entrepreneurs, they're more aggressive, and families are better choosers, and then you have some challenges there. Curriculum and assessment. I'll tell you what, I'm a complete anarchist at my heart, and I hate packaged curriculum, but at the same time, literally, it's bad. How I was terrible when I was at Teach for America. I was always like, oh, let everyone create their own curriculum. But I'm wondering now, we've learned a lot. Yeah, I know, me, an anarchist, shocking. But at the same time, the Common Core and other things have changed the game, and we've learned a lot. And I'm not sure it makes a whole lot of sense for every teacher to be mapping like mad all over the place and using stuff that we know hasn't yielded good student achievement results. We shouldn't act like we don't know a thing or two. And then furthermore, when you have real constraints in the public sector that curtail innovation, like contracts that, everybody wants to argue about, oh, well, charters are spending more and charters are doing this. And at the end of the day, what charters are doing differently is hiring and firing who they want. Fundamentally, the ones that are high performing are doing that really, really well. I mean, if you strip it down, and we have real constraints in the public sector about the ability to do that. So it's not just like they thought of like more awesome ideas. Sometimes they have, but they also have one really fundamental thing, which is the ability to pick their people, which we need to address in the public sector. And then finally, this may be sort of blasphemous to say, but new is not always better, and innovation. I think we need innovation around certain areas of our reform movement that haven't been discussed, like the hardest to serve kids, like special ed, like curriculum, like speech therapists because no one can ever hire them or we're all out of compliance. Like our demand, we don't have smart demand right now. The products we have and the needs we have are not one-to-one. So we can learn from the first generation of reforms in that regard and actually incent innovation around the areas that are sorely lacking and need even more thinking. And also we need to learn from the first generation of new schools. Not all the new schools, charter or non-charter, were effective. And we need to be real about that and model what we want the system to do, which is to, incent those that are getting results to grow and be real about the ones that aren't. So those are some of the things I'm kind of wrestling with, a couple of small questions. And if anyone has any ideas, I'm all ears. But I'm grateful for having sort of wrestled and lived through this first generation. I feel we stand on the shoulders of places like New York, and we should apply those lessons learned in this next wave of, we shouldn't seek to replicate. And I think Chancellor Klein would be the first one to say it. He would say we should take those lessons learned and, do even more, faster, better in the next wave.
So underlying also what I think Cami and Michele are both talking about is you can share a vision, but how you implement it with so many different needs of so many different kids looks different often as to hold tight and loose. And certainly both Michele and Cami have done pioneering work with those that are the most needy. So where I think that we sort of move on to from here is the whole discussion around empowerment and accountability, which is, to everyone's point, is actually become passé, as opposed to revolutionary now. And, it's so many districts are adopting that as their own theory of action. And Sharren, I think it would be just helpful if you share with us some of your learnings, because you've been at the center of this, of both with Jim Liebman, who I think is somewhere in this room, building, one of the first citywide accountability system to actually hold folks accountable, but also, a lot of the space that you're working in now with a lot of different cities as well, as to how you use these data systems to actually share knowledge amongst decentralized systems.
Absolutely. I think one of the things to think about is that when it comes to kind of the world of technology and large districts and in states, some of the work is still kind of pedestrian, right? It's not the idea that a technology office needs to be aligned to a theory of change is still a revolutionary idea on the technology side of large districts and states. What we were able to accomplish for the project I worked on in New York City was to get that ball started, right? So if the theory of change requires local data-driven decision-making, what can the central office do to provide tools, processes, and support for that, right? So how do we map the need for a teacher-driven data system, not just a central office-driven data system? And that was our big move with ARIS, right? So districts and states have spent the last 10 or 15 years investing in compliance-driven data systems or research-driven data systems or kind of federal reporting requirements data systems. And those are very important, but that's not about kind of teacher-driven innovation or school building level innovation. So what we were able to do there by the construction of the ARIS product was to provide teachers and principals opportunities to really look at the data that the central office had that they had really no way of getting to, and certainly no way of putting in one place before. And the idea of collaboration around that data, having local school building level conversations or hallway conversations about what that data said was was the intention of the product. So the investment centrally was to build a tool and a set of services and support mechanisms and processes that followed the theory of change, that drove that decision out of the central office and into classrooms and school buildings. I think building on that, certainly what I learned and what I'm kind of working with in states and districts around the country now is trying to keep moving on that shift, right? How can central offices of decentralized systems start to provide services to allow innovation to happen outside of their buildings, right? And so that's, again, a major shift for our community. Thinking about kind of product level innovation aligned with instructional innovation and assuming that happens all across the system. So what kind of investments can we make in kind of repurposable data systems, repurposable technology services that can enable innovation and not assume that all of the innovation lives in one building at the state or at the district?
Thank you. So, Kristen, you're living in the world now where you are actually, doing a lot of thinking about how to enable or how to encourage the private sector to develop technology that can actually enable these kind of innovations district-wide. Can you just share with us sort of what some of your current thinking is?
Well, I can say at a high level, we've got a lot of folks who have worked inside school systems for a long time. And the first move that my employer, News Corporation, made in this space was to acquire a really innovative data and analytics company called Wireless Generation. And what you can infer from that kind of move is that what we expect to do in the coming years will be fundamentally rooted in the power of data and analytics. Again, not for the sake of crunching a bunch of numbers and not even necessarily to have systems that will be used at the management level of districts, but really flipping the use of these kinds of systems so that, as Sharren said, they are enabling and empowering teachers to make decisions in the classroom about what their kids need to know and don't know and are struggling with. And by the way, which kids are struggling with the same issues and could help each other, and what kids 3 states away did to overcome a big gap in their knowledge, and how might what we know from that experience help a particular classroom in a neighborhood very far away, if the teacher feels that's an appropriate strategy. So it's trying to take things that happen on a regular basis in many, many other sectors of our lives that the digital revolution has completely transformed, and bring what works there and what may be relevant there from those sectors to education. And fundamentally, we will be about trying to capture the imagination of kids and empower the teachers and the learning communities to do that on a sustainable basis. And one of the areas we think there's been a lot of lack of innovation, sadly, for our kids on the imagination front is the lack of innovation in kind of curriculum and the content that's available to kids, and that Cami mentioned and others. And so we are trying to think about how that might change and find things that are working all across the globe and bring them together and offer them in a way that we hope will be useful to teachers and kids.
So Michele, can you add on that? You're leading an effort, nationwide effort, obviously, to bring more teachers who are smart about subjects related to STEM, et cetera, into the classroom. But talk to us a little bit about why, where you believe the opportunity is to marry the teaching knowledge with what's actually the tools in the classroom that are there.
So Amy's referring to a mobilization campaign that I've been engaged with now 80 partners, called 100K in 10, or 100,000 new capable teachers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We're also doing something called, with a collaboration with the Gates Foundation, the Shared Learning Collaborative, which is about technology-enabled learning. I want to bring these two together by sort of saying, what's the point of any of this, and how does this enable? That is always my starting point. But how do you try to have centers of energy that keep moving towards scale, right, and towards scaling practice. And I think the core that everyone's been talking about here, and particularly Cami, is that although all of us 10 years ago were trying to wrench up achievement, right, wrench the system toward greater academic achievement, the situation is much more urgent now. It's more urgent for obviously, it's the same equity principle, but our entire labor market has changed so dramatically that our schools are now required, if we're going to do anything for our democracy, to bring all young people to a level that we were 15 years ago only trying to get 25% of kids to. That is, that was our goal of getting them to that level. So the innovation that's required to do that are new designs. And I think people here are talking about the tensions in what those new designs should be for the system. The notion of taking STEM as another, the only word I can think of is weapon, which is a terrible thing to say, tool, but a conceptual piece of trying to excite some people, is the notion that we're getting the Common Core in literacy and mathematics, but we have to excite people about what real learning can be so that you can incentivize curriculum to be different and teaching to be different. So, and then get the human capacity to do that. You're not going to get the, people have been calling forever for 10,000 new teachers in STEM in 2 years. You're not going to get that unless they have something interesting to teach, right? And then if they can be successful at it, well, they can't be successful at what I think of as recuperative and accelerated education for kids who've fallen behind if they don't have a much different set of teaching tools, instructional tools. And our bet is that a lot of that is going to be technology enabled. And that's going to change teachers' jobs. They're going to go from what many, many teachers are not doing this, but the conception of the job had devolved into, or deteriorated into, a routine cognitive job. You convey information, people get it. And those jobs are disappearing everywhere, right? You can do that better through technology. To a non-routine cognitive and interactive job in which you're managing large sets of data about who's moving forward, who isn't, what kind of new treatment do I need, what kind of curricular things. All of this is the possibilities, but I think my point here is it's also interactive. You attract, it goes back to the same thing of starting new schools. You attract people to the job of teaching or the job of leading a school, not because they're going to spend hours mapping to do their own curriculum, but they're going to use the best curricula out there in conjunction with assessing the learning needs of the diversity of students and bringing them to a goal that they can see.
I got to get in here on the teacher thing because this is like my personal obsession. When we think about teacher quality, I mean, at the end of the day, I think the research is pretty compelling here, which is that the bottom line is we won't see like radical jumps in student achievement if we don't have great teaching going on in every classroom and in places where it may not be happening at the level we need it to. And it probably looks radically different than we see sort of on a regular basis. And you do see game changers. I mean, that's the other thing is, should we solve poverty? Should we solve good teaching? Like, sort of a ridiculous question in my estimation, but there's a reason why you can see classroom A with 20-point differential in achievement and classroom B, same kids, same family, same neighborhood. And so we started to unpack that a little bit. And the Gates Foundation has been an incredible leader in this, and I know they're doing some really innovative work that I think we should talk about. But there are different elements to this, the what, the who, the how, and the towards what end. So we talked a little bit about the who. We had all these radical debates about, you know, if we just get folks who did much better in school, is that going to make the difference? You know, all this about the who. We've talked somewhat about the how around what are the teacher inputs that end up, like what are the things that great teachers do that end up being, you know, sort of game changing. But we've talked, in my estimation, not as sort of boldly and out of the box about the what and the towards what end. And the Common Core is helping us zero in on the what. Though our assessment tools to manage towards what end are just weak sauce. I don't know what else to say than that. But my feeling is if we don't know the what and the towards what end, it makes it pretty hard to throw the gates open on the how, which I think we need to, whether it's through technology or, you know, project-based learning, or my gosh, I'm like a theater Montessori chick. I couldn't be more open to the how. But we need some serious innovation on the what and the towards what end, because those things are so fuzzy that the real innovation on the what really works to get those radical jumps, it's pretty hard, because none of the four things in that equation have clarity, and we need to get, I think, some more clarity on the what and towards what end piece, so that as we start to innovate on the how and the who, we actually have a yardstick against which to measure whether that innovation, you know, in the private sector, it's like, did you sell more stuff? In our world, it's like, did you get more radical achievement? Well, what does that mean? We're not measuring in a very sophisticated fashion, and until we are, I think it's going to be hard to isolate the inputs that are actually driving those levels of achievement.
Did you want to say something? Well, a lot of this conversation, I think it's important to think about what you're both talking about are what are the conditions for innovation in education. And I think when you go into a district for the first time, a district in need of reform, your inclination might be, we've got to innovate, but innovation doesn't just happen. And I think a lot of defining what you're after, what the goals are, and then creating a bunch of conditions around human capital, around transparency, and facilitating communication, because you've got up against you tremendous barriers to innovation in education. On the public side and on the private side, inertia is a really powerful force. We've talked about it. Culture change is really, really difficult. Innovation is not a really popular word in within school systems, even within, you know, at the higher scale, at the state and federal level sometimes. And on the private side, there's been a total lack of investment for many, many years, or at least lack of effective investment. And so trying to figure out ways in which the private sector can make really meaningful investments, I think, is a very important step in ensuring that we do have innovation in education in the longer term. And some of the things like the Common Core, and a lot of the dynamics in the human capital front that Cami was describing will help create the conditions, we hope, for much more significant investment in really innovative stuff in education, because it can't be solved in the public sector alone, from my perspective.
I'd also say without that framework or those conditions for innovation being set out, there's actually not much technology's been able to deliver against, right? Because technology-driven innovation in education tends to be a one product at a time experience. So one product might be better or more innovative than the next product, but the way it's deployed in a system, the way it's kind of managed for effectiveness or for maximum impact, the way it's scaled, those are all incredibly kind of developing communications. So even as we talk about, so as a software developer person, innovation and technology for me, you know, go hand in hand in my brain, and it's been just fascinating to learn in this community that we're not necessarily set up for that, right? And so the framework for innovation or the conditions for innovation need to include how you would deploy technology and how you'd measure it over time to judge its impact, to make sure that the innovation can be unlocked.
So interesting for me to listen to these four people agree on everything. This is this may be a first, everybody. So let's just for a minute, and then I'm going to try to do 4 speed dating questions. So if everybody has questions, think about them. But let's just get to the here and now for a minute. Back to you, Cami, as the practitioner at the table. You came into Newark 8 weeks before the school opened, and you know, you made a calculated decision that, you know, your key levers was going to be principals, and I can't remember the numbers, but I think by some miracle you actually changed out something like 1/3 of the principals in the system. How far are we into the school year?
I don't know. About 8 weeks.
About 8 weeks.
Yeah.
About 8 weeks later.
Yep.
How's it going, and what do you need to be successful?
How much time do we have? No, I mean, if you talk particularly about the leadership piece, right? I think there is a massive. We've all sort of mentioned the notion of a mindset shift from a hierarchical culture where you sort of sit and wait for Central to tell you what to do, and then when you don't get results, you have someone that you can blame. To, you know, you're the chief executive. Here, I'm going to give as much decision-making as possible to you within reason, given, laws and that sort of thing, and contracts and, and that's a very big mindset shift. And I think the one thing that's nice about having a third of new principals, they're helping to change the conversation because many of them are coming already in with more of that mindset than folks who have been there, which isn't to say there aren't some folks who have been there who very much have that mindset shift and just don't tell anyone. So it's just a massive change management piece. And I'm trying to figure out how to differentiate our support and coaching of our principals, given that they're all in different places with skill and will around sort of like owning their chief executiveness, if you will. And I feel like we're in a place of discomfort, which bums me out, but also makes me think we're on the right track.
That is that, that very discomfort that lives with disruptive strategies. So let's, I know we weren't supposed to do this, but I see so many people in here that may do it. So let's just take 4 questions in a row, and we'll keep track of them, and each of you can decide which one you want to answer. In the back. So wait a minute, so can you speak up? I'm sorry.
Teach your voice.
It's talked about globally, but it's not modeled in leadership, and the teaching community is so adverse to predominantly female to the dynamics of a leader. How do we retrain teachers to allow leadership to be effective in the dynamics of shift and change, and they know differently.
Okay, so we have that question in terms of what's actually being done to document and change. This gentleman here.
Hi, I'm John Alden, and my question would go something like this, and I'll try to frame it very quickly. In business, there's a metric that has to do with the way your customer is served, and typically there's an expression about the ecology associated with that business. And that typically means in, let's say, software development, how many developers you have, or whatever, how many partners you have. And I'm wondering whether you have put that metric or something like it on the school systems, both New York and Newark and others, where it may be a little insensitive to say once it was just a fragmented bunch of parent groups that saluted to whatever the principal wanted to do, or the teachers, or good feeling parents. Has it changed? Do you have 10 groups per urban school? Do you have 100? Do you have 1,000 at a district level? Can you characterize something of the ecology? Because, by the way, that's where a lot of the innovation comes.
Is your question around what metrics you're actually using, or specifically around parent group?
You have a massive social system, public education, not engaging in a formal way with the outer boundary.
And the demand side.
And the demand, yeah.
And if you just go to, well, how did Bill Gates and company make a lot of money? They have millions of people in their ecosystem, as does Apple.
Got it. Got it. Thank you. So we're going to, each question can only take 1 minute to give.
I have a question for all of you, or anyone who wants to answer. So I've been reading Class Warfare. It's a great book. Stephen Rowe talks about sort of the process that all of you went through in the early 2000s. I'm curious, as of 2011, 2012, what are the primary obstacles? You guys kept talking about the inertia. What are the primary obstacles to change that you guys are facing? And then, more importantly, what can you do about it?
Excellent. One last one. Right there. No, I'm sorry. I didn't, you were too down on the floor.
Taxpayers have a real stake in the success of education reform. How can we support such efforts moving forward?
Thank you. All right, anybody want to choose a question, or you want me to assign them?
You assign.
Okay.
Obstacles to change.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure we all can, actually, but we're giving quick answers?
Yep.
Okay. So on inertia, you know, all many of the obstacles relate back to inertia. There's cultural issues, the way things have been done for a really long time. I think some of the obstacles to change relate to obstacles and barriers to innovation too. Think about it, you've got a system in which the key actors, the most powerful and potentially impactful people, the teachers, are in classrooms with closed doors, no technology infrastructure to speak of to communicate with one another down the hall, much less in other schools and other cities and states and countries for that matter. So you've got a lot of isolation, a culture and a status quo that is preserved by many, many forces beyond inertia, but also some special interests who are quite happy with the status quo. So you've got a resistance to change that's very, very powerful. And in order to start to break that down, you have to have a huge cultural change. And that is something that I think anyone trying to do disruptive change and reform in schools struggles with. I don't know anybody who's done it exceedingly well. It's very, very hard. We made many, many mistakes along the way and faced many challenges in doing that. But it gets to also the question about how can taxpayers help? It's engaging so many more people and organizations and stakeholders beyond the classroom and the school and the district office that A, there's a problem, which we've become better at over the past decade, and B, that it's fixable. There has to be hope in order for people to be motivated to invest a bunch of money, time, energy, tears, blood in this work. And in terms of just practical things we did in driving the cultural shift, it was really trying to invert the system. So we talked a lot about leadership and empowerment of principals, but we actually tried to flip the bureaucracy so it became a service center. So think of the schools being on top, the bureaucracy on the bottom. We went so far in New York to try to sell some of the support services, devolve the dollars to the schools and say, buy back from us whatever you want. What we give to you now is worth X dollars. We'll give you the dollars. If you want to buy them back from us, do it. If you want to go somewhere else to someone who can provide it better. So it's different crazy things like that help to change the mind shift, but it's not easy.
Thank you. These are hard, big questions, so we're going to do them quickly. Sharren, just from where you sit at Gates, do you want to do the case studies or or have anything to add around sort of how we're keeping track of what's actually going on? To the first question.
So I think it's an accurate observation to point out a lack of clear metrics of system change. Right? How do we know, either from a district or state policy side or from a funder side, how do we know the investment in the work is having impact, and impact for whom? Right. The first metrics have to be about student achievement, but in order to talk about real system-wide change, we need to develop additional metrics. And even student achievement and teacher effectiveness needs to be based on multiple metrics. The work that my colleagues on the MET project are doing at Gates really are about developing a common understanding of what those multiple metrics could be. But those are still around teacher and classroom and student achievement activities. The idea of how to develop an ecosystem, how to hold out opportunities for change and opportunities to engage in innovation across a wide variety of stakeholders is something we really are just getting started on.
Thanks. Michele, you want to do the demand question?
Yes. It's something I think about a lot, about the demand side, because most of what we've talked about here is how do you drive innovation in systems that don't know where they're going and they have really poor management systems. And so how do we bring them up to date? That's the professional technical core. We can't be divorced from demand. But demand is a place where we haven't made as much progress. And I was doing community organizing 40 years ago, so I've sort of been on the demand side for a long time. Here's what I think has a direction to go, that's something beginning to work a bit, and what it's trying to target. The problem it's trying to target is that we're in a period of time where people who are, where we have less social mobility than we've had since the 1920s, where we have greater inequality, and where people are angry and feeling hopeless. And kids get that message all the time, and parents get that message. Similarly, and try to do this quickly, in the upper middle classes and the people who are advantaged, there's so much more opportunity to control your own child's education. And technology venture capitalists are right now creating products to sell to what they call the creative classes, who have enormous anxiety about where their kids are going. So somehow we have to be creating a demand that builds on the possibility that there is a pathway from where you are now to this new set of 21st century knowledge, skills, and ability to apply all of this. And we haven't figured out how to do that. The positive things are strategies that are using mediating organizations, ones in which schools are not the only messengers of what this can be, whether that's faith-based organizations or community-based organizations, or new charter management organizations, or in New York City, like New Visions, that were the school developers for this, but people who have ability through other routes to get to the participants. And the second is to create groups that cross the consumer professional technical core issues. And that's what the kinds of things we're doing with partnership, really big new designs for partnerships. So in the STEM area, we've just run an Ashoka Changemakers competition for demand for new kinds of solutions to STEM schools. And we got, Ashoka generally, they had predicted to us about 80 applications, and we had 266. So it's getting, it's not perfect, but it's trying to generate sources of energy in different places.
Thanks. All right, Cami, so you're going to finish up with how we meant, nope, taxpayers. So the question, I think, from the question from on the taxpayers were, you know, I think, how do we message what we need to get the taxpayers on our side?
Well, I think I have
or
to.
Maybe you heard it differently.
I have to link the principal question potentially to the demand one.
Okay.
Just because and it maybe is somewhat related to the taxpayer question. I don't know. But I'm going to answer the question I want to answer.
And that's our friend Cami.
The anarchist. So basically, I mean, every year for the last like 10 years, I've facilitated the school leaders who are getting game-changing results panel at the Teach for America Alumni Summit. And 10 years ago, when I facilitated the panel, there were 3 people on there and maybe 50 people in the audience. And, you know, last year, I think our keynote was President Obama. And my session was in the ballroom. And I refused to give up that job because I learned so much just listening to what are the common elements of game-changing principles. And you know, honestly, the core of that answer hasn't changed that much in the last 10 years, though I think products could sort of accelerate their ability to do that work at scale and other people's ability to do that work. And I think we need to do more, frankly, to codify what that is. Places like New Leaders for New Schools and others have tried to isolate what some of those factors are, but I don't think we've done it enough in a research-based way, in a transparent enough way, in a teaching case way, which relates to the hopeful message. People don't believe that there are game-changing schools. There are. There are. And not just charter, not just new. There aren't a lot, but there are 90 schools where 90% of the kids are on free and reduced lunch and 90% of students are doing math and reading at or above grade level. They exist, not 1 or 2 anymore. And the beautiful thing about the first wave of ed reform is we don't have a couple of proof points. Now we have hundreds. And so I think part of the piece about hope for taxpayers, you know, creating demand is doing a better job of articulating what are the key pieces there that go beyond, you know, work 30 hours a day and, you know, be God, and do it with a smile on your face. I mean, there are, so, and that's important because I just was talking yesterday about with a group of community and business leaders in Newark about if my theory of change is that I need, 90 chief executives of schools, but the demand is for, Joe Clark, then that's not going to be very effective. And I've already had a couple circumstances where folks I removed were beloved, where 19% of the students were at proficiency, which is even half of the 40 that is our average. So for me, this is where those things all link, and I hope that we do a better job of codifying, the game changers and culling from that sort of replicable and practical pieces that don't involve sort of mystifying what that means and making it more accessible, because my personal thing is no matter how good the products are, if we don't have awesome school leaders, this is, who then in turn coach and support and empower awesome teachers, the rest of this will be window dressing. Exactly. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So on that note, we're gonna, now that we have spent 59 minutes trying to talk about some really complicated issues in brief answers, I just want to thank all of you for being willing to take your time and help us here. So thank you.